You're walking down the street one day when you hear a woman behind you yell out, "Help, help." And you look behind you and her house is on fire. It's a literal inferno. So you walk over and the authorities haven't arrived. There's no one there to stop the blaze. And so she basically says to you, "We need to do something about this fire. Will you help me put it out? There are people inside. There's harm to the house. People may die if this continues. It may spread. There may be plenty of issues." And so you say, "Of course, I'll help you." And you really think about the best way to help. And the best way to help is to basically go out and quickly find more people to help, to quickly go down to the shop, which is right next to the street, and buy whatever equipment you can. It's to find water and use that water as best you can to put out this enormous blaze. And you're doing it for moral reasons, of course you are. And so you say to the woman, nonetheless, and she understands what you're saying, "I'm going to go out, I'm going to find men. These men are probably going to want money, because it's a really dangerous job. It's an incredibly dangerous job. I'm going to need to go out and buy equipment in order to help you. There will be a cost to the water, there's going to be a cost to the men, there's going to be a lot of expense involved with this. I want to help you, but first I need to know, will you pay me to do this? Because at the very least I need someone to cover the costs." And the woman, of course, says yes, yes, and you would. You would, whether you were in either situation. Whether you're the woman, whether you're the man trying to help. Now this is hugely important, I think, because it's one of the first arguments that I heard in regard to dealing with PMCs, the reason why, they're often deemed to be moral among proponents. I think the firefighter argument is interesting because it serves an incredibly important purpose, and I think it's very good. I think it's not a brilliant argument for PMCs, but it is incredibly good nonetheless in demonstrating a lot of other stuff. So, I think it's important that we look at it, because actually, fundamentally, it sounds like a pretty good argument for allowing PMCs to help. A lot of PMC proponents use this. It highlights a few things. So the thing I think it highlights pretty well is the chain of action that every private security company basically takes. So first off, there has to be a problem to begin with. The house is on fire. There's a nation in conflict. There is unrest. There's a problem that needs a solution, and that either comes internally or externally. Secondarily, it's consensual. The owner of the house, the government, the people of the nation, they admit that there is disorder, that there's conflict, that they simply cannot solve this problem themselves, perhaps. Or perhaps even if it's non-consensual, even if this woman is saying, "Don't put out the house fire that's going to kill people," a person is helping put out this fire, is helping in the conflict, in order to save the people inside the house, in order to save the people being killed by conflict. Or to prevent, let's say, the spread of fire to nearby houses. In any case, it's deemed necessary. It is good. It's moral. It comes from the right intention that we talked about with Aquinas. Even if one has to break down the door to get inside this house, the intention is still correct and you're doing good overall. And I think also there is ample reason for payment, both in helping someone, else put out the fire, and in gathering equipment. It follows just law's right intention, even better. Effectively, you're trying to do good. And naturally, if you were to do this and realise that this were a problem that takes place a lot, that perhaps the authorities don't get involved, and this isn't saying anything against the British military. They obviously have really incredible judgment and they consider things very well. This is just an argument that's put forward, and I don't think anyone who puts it forward, even that are proponents of PMCs, is saying that the UK is not doing its job. In any case, anyone who did this, who realised it's a common problem, would probably ask for a little bit more money. Try and profit off this so that they can build an operation and they can help more people. Charities often do exactly the same thing. They make a profit so that they can grow, so that they can expand. They might not necessarily be taking that profit home, but nonetheless, it's the same sort of thing. You're growing an operation so that you can do more good. The firefighter argument, it's a pretty gross oversimplification. I like it, but it is a pretty gross oversimplification, and it doesn't factor in, really the socioeconomic, geopolitical, theological, cultural issues. Conflict is not simple in cause. So I think it's worth, while I do like the firefighter argument, I think we're just going to go over what perhaps makes it not so great. People who put forward this position say that the solution is clear, that it's, only good to intervene, it's common sense, it's moral duty, and that's an important thing. And of course, if it's, in a nation's self-interest to prevent conflict, and it is, because people prosper when there is no conflict, generally, within that nation itself. If one looks at stuff like domino theory, generally, peace promotes good trade conditions, then one should aim to put out the fire. One shouldn't aim to let the blaze spread, both internally within the country and outside of the country. Now, here is the thing I think is important, because actually, there was someone who really put it well to me, and I think it's probably worth hearing. So, here is the thing. If we are going to basically compare war to a building on fire, which is what we're doing in this scenario entirely, it's a good thing to stop the blaze. And the justification could be, in any case, the owner wants the fire put out. There are people trapped inside. The authorities, they're not putting out the fire, or perhaps they need help putting out the fire and they employ you. And I think that is generally moral. That's far more difficult to debunk, but let's just say the authorities aren't there. There's a risk the fire will spread. Now, in any case, it does make the assumption of simplicity, the assumption of innocence, of pacifism. It's not always clear how the fire should be stopped, whether it would be made worse. You're not going to do too well in pouring water on an electrical fire. In war, in defense, even in a war zone, let's say a security contractor is operating to defend a base, it's not as simple as going and doing good to inanimate fire. It's potentially having to do harm to those who try to attack the base. And so this is the way it was put to me, and I think this is a really brilliant way of putting it. You basically modify the argument. A friend of mine adapted it quite simply, and it becomes difficult to maintain. And it makes it more realistic with the sort of parameters of conflict. Now, obviously, we have to create heuristics. We have to simplify stuff a lot, because that's the way we operate as humans, and that's an important thing for maintaining, I guess, operational capability in the military and elsewhere. But it's not necessarily as simple as that, and perhaps authorities have means by which they can determine this on a higher level. So let's say you turn up to a house. This is the scenario my friend made, and he actually wrote it out to me in an email. You turn up to this house, and there's smoke coming from within. It may be on fire internally, but it's difficult to say. One can't really say the size of the fire, if one even exists. How fast it will grow, whether it will spread to houses nearby, probably not. Whether the fire inside is, a necessity for the occupants. Maybe they have to start a fire. Maybe they intended to start a fire. 3 people then stand outside. It's unclear who's the homeowner. Is it the grandfather, the father, or the mother? Those are the 3 people. And the grandfather says to stay away from the house. He doesn't want you inside the home. The mother says that the father and his sons are trying to destroy the house. And the father says that the mother and her daughters are trying to destroy the house. And internally, if they cross paths, they will fight to the death. Both want your help. The mother will pay you more, but seems less trustworthy. The father will pay you less, but seems more trustworthy. If you choose to enter the house, you will have to pick a side and be willing to fight to the death anyone from the side you don't choose to be loyal to. The man across the street shouts over to you that, this sort of thing happens all the time. The house may get set on fire from time to time, but eventually it calms down for periods. It may spread to nearby houses on occasion, but not too often. And you can't really say what's going to happen this time. You may potentially have to destroy parts of the building to contain the fire, to, separate the blaze, sort of what Australian people do with wildfires. It turns out as well you don't have the proper firefighting kit, just a sledgehammer to break down doors, fight anyone who attacks you, and basically break parts of the building you're trying to stop the fire in, after realising the fire is necessarily artificial, that it's constantly being set, that there is some sort of saboteur. You now have to make a decision to find and take out the side you are not loyal to in order to stop more fire being set, despite the fact that your own side is setting fire. Is that complicated enough for you? And I'm going to say it probably is, because it is massively complicated, and that's not even digging into the slight issues with sort of creating these thought experiments that arise, is that it's not necessarily comparable to the real world, but when we do our best to compare it to the real world, it doesn't necessarily make much sense, and the real world is messy. Just like this thought experiment when you adapt it a little bit. So I think that's an important thing to look at. Now, people basically then say, I'll just go away from that email. They effectively then say, well, if I'm there on the scene myself, and we are to say that it's simple, and let's say we are to say it's as complex as that situation, I have free will, and, that's, I guess, a sort of wider symptom of the free market within the world. If we're to look within reality, not only do people have free will to do what they want, to an extent, put it this way, PMCs can generally get away with operating, whether it's legal or perhaps not, we're going to look at that later. They can generally get away with operating, so what we can say is that this free will, this ability to choose whether you side with one side, whether you don't go in, whether you go in alone, whether you effectively take the house for yourself in order to stop the blaze, in order to minimize damage, whatever decision you come to, it's through free will. And the way you can exercise that in the world, in reality, is through free markets. So free markets are effectively the natural evolution of having multiple social parties. And so the world is a free market if it's comprised of multiple nations, and generally that holds true. You have perhaps more diplomatic arrangements for certain things, but an individual operating within the world operates generally within a free market, particularly if you travel to the place you're willing to trade with, because it's then internal trade. And that's the case with PMCs often. If one is to operate in a free market within this international sphere, and within a place of war, a place of conflict, where people often don't have much regulation internally within this nation, they're just worried about being helped, then the free market is actually an excellent mechanism to do that. It's an excellent mechanism to do what you think is moral. So if one stops PMCs operating based on the free market principles, then not only is there a lot more one has to stop, a decision that is inherently personal, inherently on the basis of morality, let's say, but one would have to stop a lot more that sort of follows the same regulations, going into conflict zones, operating perhaps through the free market, and helping these nations in their times of crisis. So let's say paid general aid organisations, private personal security services. You probably have to stop private security contracting on stuff like ships, where people actually often agree that it's a very good thing to do. People aren't often so worried about that. Or perhaps warehouse maintenance for military purposes. There's a lot of stuff one would have to stop. Now, of course, one can say this is different because it's active harm, and we can talk about that a little later, but basically, in effect, those who argue for this imply that one shouldn't be placing limits on the free market, particularly when the results are so dire. They are incredibly consequential, and the results are the continuation of conflict. The results are a lack of force to potentially stop that conflict, and the results of that are further harm. Now, I don't agree with necessarily any of these arguments per se, because I think they are rather surface level. But let's say, just sort of a tangent, let's say we don't want anyone to die within the situation at all, even if it's warranted. The externality from the PMC market, which is consequential, is the death of those people, obviously. But alternatively, the result is basically the death of the people being defended, or the continuation of conflict, which may cause more death. It's a lot of, the same arguments that people make for drastic action within World War II that caused a lot of harm, but actually may have saved a lot of life in the process. And one can't necessarily know that, but I think on this micro level, one perhaps can more within PMC operation, and PMCs generally do operate on the micro level more. So this is getting a bit confusing, obviously, and it's a bit of a ramble by me because I tend to ramble. But let's say with the assumption that PMCs are going to operate ethically and properly and to a military standard, or the closest thing to it, PMCs are providing intervention through market systems. So this is perhaps not economics, but something akin to. So it is a military intervention of some sort through free market systems. They're security firms, meaning that they intervene so that those, I guess, defending remain out of harm's way, or that those basically trying to prevent conflict can do it more effectively. So in that sense, they are the intervention, the PMC itself. Now, the free market intervention, because this is where it does get a bit confusing, because I'm using intervention in two ways, regardless of law, because we'll look at that later, would be, let's say, banning or the illegalization of use of PMCs. Therefore, financial intervention, let's say, there is no military intervention whatsoever, not only cripples the worldwide free market trade system, because you're going to have to apply the same standards to that operate to a major degree, even supporting certain sides within war zones, financiers of good war efforts, as it were. But it prevents that intervention with the most severe consequences again, which is death because of conflict. Death of basically the people you think should be defended. And people argue that it's immoral to prevent PMCs operating, and this is actually perhaps a better argument. Basically, both due to the consequence when looking at the inability often of militaries to operate due to the issues that it basically internationally creates with trade deals of equal magnitude and effect, and institutions that provide financial services. You see a lot of the same standards applied. Recently we had basically a lot of European nations trying to prevent Russia from accessing credit through certain European credit lines, I think sort of SWIFT. In any case, why have I rambled on this long about firemen and the free market? Because I think it's important. These are the two arguments that will basically crop up first for proponents of PMCs. Now, do I think they're convincing? Initially, yes, they're very convincing, and they convinced me for a little bit. I really had to consider this properly, but actually, looking at them retrospectively, they are not so convincing. We've seen why the fireman argument doesn't necessarily work, and obviously there are certain limits one has to place because it's a different standard in actively harming, in actively taking it upon yourself to do harm, whether that is choosing to do it individually or perhaps even supporting a government in doing it, and supporting a government perhaps you have more I guess you'd say authority to do so because they are choosing, and so long as it's a legitimate government, then you're sort of in safer waters. But in any case, I don't think these should be the arguments we're going for if we are to say that PMCs are operating ethically, that they are good, that they are moral. But I do think that actually, for all that I've criticised these arguments today, there is huge value, and here is where the value lies. It is that every single time I have talked to somebody who is involved with PMCs, and I asked them, do you think it's moral? And they will have all sorts of, not just this, but incredibly complex ethical arguments that I'll go into at a later date. Incredibly complex legal arguments that I'll go into at a later date. This is always what they come to first. These two arguments, free will, free markets, and the firefighter argument. And what I think that shows, more than anything, is that these people actually do operate on a basis of morality. One can say, perhaps in a lot of cases that they are operating off of stuff that, values that are inherently greedy, let's say. But a lot of these people, truly do come to these arguments first because they see it, maybe this black and white. And while I don't agree with that black and white view of the world necessarily, the fact of the matter is that if they see it this way, then it's probably correct that they have, most of them, the right intention at heart. And we actually see that evidenced a lot in, let's say, operation of PMCs in the 80s, operation of PMCs during the war on terror. They did a lot of stuff, basically pro bono, because they do care, because, at the core, whether one can argue, is it legal? Do they have justification? Do they have warrant to do what they do? Most people who are involved with this aren't power-hungry psychopaths, but actually generally moral people who want the best. See the world in, perhaps a more black and white way, and perhaps that's not such a bad thing because they're trying to do their very best in that scenario. So whether PMCs, private military corporations, are good or not, whether we think they should be allowed or not, whether the government supports them or not, those who actually operate within them, and they do exist, see them as very moral. And so, I guess this is a very, very, very long way of saying, in a lot of ways, PMCs generally justify themselves on a primary basis through Aquinas' right intention. Now that is going to be incredibly confusing because I've just rambled on for ages about basically nonsense. But nonetheless, and no one will have actually come to the conclusion because they'll have been put off by the rambling, but I think this is important. I think it's consequential, and I think these arguments are actually worth analysis because they do say something meaningful about PMCs and those who operate within them. So I'll end it there at the 22-minute mark.